well. There's a lot of things I don't do well, but holding microphones is on the list. So it's really a pleasure to be here. I want to thank the whole SGA for inviting me. I love the fact that this is called Yachts and Sanctions. I feel like we should have a whole series on Yachts and Sanctions. I know almost nothing about yachts. So of the two, I think you can expect me to be a little bit heavier on the sanctions side. And I do see a number of familiar faces. Some have taken my sanctions classes before, others who've taken my leadership class here. I hope it won't be too repetitive. And I also want to apologize in advance. I am full on in teaching mode. I'm teaching 2 classes this fall, one on Wednesday, one on Thursday, and so I am not in like lecture to a big room mode, so I might ask you some questions, which, who knows, maybe you'll even be brave enough to chime in. It does help get the juices flowing, especially early in the morning. So, opening question, what do we think of going after the Russian oligarchs' yachts as a policy decision by, let's call it the West? Primarily it's been the US, UK, and EU, but I can call it the West for simplicity's sake. Obviously, there's a lot more to this sanctions program than just going after these wealthy Russians' assets. But as part of a broader sanctions plan, how many of you would support sanctioning the oligarchs and trying to freeze their assets? Show of hands. Okay, and the people who didn't raise their hand is because you have both hands on your laptops? Yeah, you would have voted for it too? Okay, so we've got unanimity. I'll put my hand up too. It's worth pausing though and asking why. Why do we think that's a good idea? Before we even get to that, what's an oligarch? Anyone want to help me with the definition? I feel like we all kind of know it, but in this context, it's worth asking because there are a whole lot of people who call me in my legal job, aside from being a professor here, I also work on the side as a lawyer, and they say, what am I doing on the list? I'm not an oligarch. So it's worth interrogating that. What is an oligarch? You want to help us?
I think it's like the Russian super rich, and I believe the term came into effect after the fall of the Soviet Union. We're kind of scooping up market shares of failing industries. So it's like a very small group of people.
That's awesome. That's better than I would have done. So Russian, super rich, and the term really comes into play at the fall of the Soviet Union when you've got this no-bid, very crony-like and corrupt process of handing out major state assets, including petroleum, railroad, all of these other mines, to, you said, a very select few. Those select few were known as oligarchs. In some cases, they were already Russian business elites. In other cases, they were people senior in the security system. In yet other cases, they were just friends of Vladimir Putin. My favorite was his judo teacher. He was a cello player who is a multi-billionaire, which has most other cellists very jealous because it's hard to get that rich just playing the cello, but he's managed. Is that set of people who were enriched then at the fall of the Soviet Union it, or are there others? Who else might we include in the set of Russian oligarchs? So I think that is definitely the right starting place. You hear people refer to others who got rich over, let's say, the Putin years, Medvedev years, as also being oligarchs, even if they didn't quite do it through being handed these state ministries. Okay, so we've got a set of oligarchs. One thing that's worth pausing on, though, is do they all deserve to be on our bad list? So there are many who go to the press and who say, I don't belong on this sanctions list. I'm not a friend of Putin's. Yes, I'm a very wealthy Russian, but I actually am totally apolitical. And where is the crime in having been successful? Yes, Russia's a corrupt place, but I never bribed him. I'm not a close friend of his. Then there are others, we can think, probably those of you who follow Russia, there are wealthy Russians who, at least in the last 5 to 10 years, maybe not in the last 1 year, have been critical of Putin, have been outspoken against him. But they're rich and they're Russian. Are they oligarchs? Should they be on a sanctions list? It seems like they're actually courageously standing up to the regime that we're trying to pressure, so maybe they're the opposite of oligarchs. But as you think about it, it becomes very hard to draw a bright line around what this set is, especially because if on one end you've got Vladimir Putin's boyhood friend / judo teacher, who's clearly in his inner circle, at the other end you have wealthy Russians who were courageous and spoke out. So think of Sergei Magnitsky, type of person, so a brave dissident. There definitely is a spectrum in between those two sets, and there's probably a set of people here who aren't going to risk their lives and their families' lives to speak out, but who have complete disdain for Putin. They're not his bosom friends. They probably loathe him in private, but they also need to get by. And getting by means not criticizing him in that society. How many wealthy Chinese do you see speaking out against Xi Jinping? Very, very, very few. So if we imagine there's this set of people who are probably sympathetic to the West's view of Putin but aren't saying anything publicly, what do we do with this set of oligarchs? I actually don't want to talk about that. I just wanted to raise the question because from this moment on we're going to talk about sanctioning them, and I think it is worth at least opening up an asterisk as to who the them is. Okay, so let's say we just limit our sanctions to the bad ones. Let's say we've got amazing intelligence and we've been able to identify who the true cronies of Vladimir Putin are, the ones who are really in bed with him and in his inner circle. Why sanction them? We all put our hands up. There must be a why. What are we trying to do with this? Yeah?
Well, so actually, I thought this thing you were talking about the group as well, but if the purpose is to ultimately put pressure on the Russian government to change its policy, then it's not really a question of punishing them. It's a question of who's going to get you the outcome you want.
Okay. So you're already 2 steps ahead of most people in the sanctions space because you're saying, what's our ultimate objective? And let's walk back from there. Our ultimate objective is, how would you describe it here?
Well, that's a question for like the policymakers, right? But at this point in time, it's to get Russia to retreat from Ukraine.
Okay, perfect. So we want Russia to retreat from Ukraine, at the very least to go back to where things were, what they call the status quo ante, before the February invasion, where Russia was pushing into new parts of Ukraine, at least to go back to just holding Crimea and these more limited areas. The theory of how we get there would be we put pressure, financial pressure, on those close to Putin, and then what happens? And so I'm taking you from this part. If you want to get us to here, what does the middle look like? What's the theory of the case? Yeah?
I think our assumption is that Putin will hold their opinions in high regard if he needs them for something, and they can, elicit a response from him that just general sanctions on all of Russia.
Good. Okay, so 2 theories in 1 sentence. That's extra credit. Putin holds their opinions in high regard, so that if they feel the heat and advise him, oh, boss, I think we need to back off a little bit, he might be more receptive to their views than an ordinary Russian. And then the second thing you said is he may need them. In which point they actually have leverage. It's not just that they're respected and their advice might have some weight to it, but that they could actually lean on him even a little bit. So what do we think of that? Either or both of those theories and the likelihood of success. Put yourself in the shoes of Vladimir Putin, and in comes a Rotenberg, one of these super wealthy oligarchs who you've enriched, and they say, I didn't realize all of this was going to happen. I'm totally with you, by the way. Ukraine, Crimea, the whole thing is ours. It should have never been given up, but this has proven pretty costly, and I'm now, both of my mega yachts were seized. We ought to rethink this. How does that conversation play out? Yeah?
It could go either way. You could be trying to incentivize these oligarchs to go to Putin and advise restraint, but you might actually embolden them and say, US is going to lift these sanctions, even if I advise Putin to go another way. So you might bring it back on that.
Okay, so that's going to always be true with sanctions. It's a very good point, which is sometimes the target of sanctions concludes that these really aren't sincerely being used as a means of changing my conduct. In fact, they're just a demonstration of hatred towards me. And so no matter what I do, they'll never be lifted. At which point, you're right, you actually double down on your conduct, and the sanctions have backfired. So that's always a risk with sanctions. I think it's one of the reasons, at least in my class, we spend a lot of time talking about not just the application of sanctions, but clarifying what are your conditions for lifting them, and how important it is to then follow through and lift them. There have been a number of instances where the US has been a little bit hazy on what are the conditions for lifting, or worse, the term is usually move the goalpost. Our sanctions are here because you're doing this one thing we don't like, and then the sanctions remain in place. Naturally, the regime or government does other things we don't like, and then the list starts to grow, at which point you end up 15 years later with a sanctions program that has 5 or 6 predicates. Well, think about what that does to the psychology of somebody. Are they really going to change one of those predicates if they feel like the sanctions are going to stay on because of 4 others? But let's put that aside, because we're looking here at the theory of the case for the hoped-for result of sanctions, acknowledging it's never going to be 100%. But how are we going to get that change in behavior? So the change in behavior would be the oligarch walks in and has that conversation with Putin, and how does it go?
Well, maybe even if they don't say anything, or even if they express support, I think it could start putting pressure on, or making Putin more paranoid that he's losing support with all these powerful people all around the country. Like, even if they explicitly say, maybe we should back up this campaign, or if they say, I completely support you, either way, you start to wonder if people are going to work against you because they're going to squeeze.
Good. So even if we haven't changed the objective reality of how any of these oligarchs feel, we might be sowing seeds of distrust, which is something Professor McLaughlin, Professor Ridd would talk about in terms of clandestine intelligence operations. There's often that goal of sowing seeds, even if they're not quite legitimate, of distrust among senior people. And sanctions might have a way of doing that. But let's go back to the leverage that these oligarchs have and how likely it is that they can use that leverage, both the influence you talked about and their financial influence, to bring about a change in Putin's military objectives. Yeah?
I think it's not impossible, but probably unlikely they're going to simply change their minds about something this big because their yachts got seized. But I also wonder if that doesn't mean it's not worth doing, because it raises the cost of the transaction, either to them or, more importantly, to the next person who's thinking about doing this. So it's no longer as cheap as it were.
What is the subject of that sentence? What is no longer as cheap as it was?
I wouldn't say invading Ukraine, but let's say something that enraged the entire West.
Okay, so interesting. You're raising a different objective of sanctions that is often at the back of the minds of people who are sitting in my old job in the sanctions chair, and it has almost nothing to do with the people of Ukraine and the current crisis. It's deterrence.
Right.
It's thinking about the next time, and maybe China-Taiwan is on your mind. If a country is toying with the idea of invading its neighbor, they should know there will be colossal economic consequences. And so even if we don't think we're going to change Putin's mind, there might be a value to doing it. I think that's worth keeping in mind. But the primary objective here, certainly if you read the quotes of Secretary Yellen, National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, Tony Blinken, they're not talking about the next conflict. They're saying these sanctions are about helping us solve the current conflict. And I'll tell you, there's really only 2 things that are being done by the West to solve the current conflict. It's supplying weapons, offensive and defensive, to the military of Ukraine, and this sanctions campaign, including the yachts. So there's a lot of freight that's being carried by these sanctions. How is it going to help us get out of the current crisis? Yeah.
I have a question. Like, Western governments also imposing sanctions, so I'm thinking particularly of the UK, as a means to like de-Russify their economy. So if you look at like people like Alisher Usmanov, Roman Abramovich, like they have so much control in the UK economy per se, and they're using sanctions in a way to like detox themselves from this. Do you think that's also an objective?
It's an interesting question. I've actually never been asked that before. What would the ultimate objective of that be? Or to put it actually more crisply, what is the concern that the UK government would have about the level of wealthy Russian holdings in London real estate, in British soccer teams, football teams? What do you think is animating them?
I think PR is a big driver.
Yeah.
Because if you have the really wealthy club in the middle of London, in a really posh area, that's owned by a Russian oligarch, it's not really a good look.
Yeah.
So I think PR is a very good, especially because Chelsea is supported by a lot of like really rich establishment people.
Yeah. So this is a objective for sanctions that no one has ever said out loud, at least in my hearing, and you're certainly not going to hear it from British politicians, is we are today sanctioning these oligarchs because we look awfully bad after having encouraged their investment in our economy and done nothing about it for years. Could that be a purpose? I would say probably likely a collateral benefit, but not the driving objective. Because there's bad press from all sorts of wealthy princelings' holdings, and you don't see London putting financial sanctions on whether it's folks from Dubai or Qatar or China, you name it, in order to detox their system. So I would say that's probably something they're maybe enjoying as a secondary benefit. Yes?
Just on that point though, I mean, wasn't this a major issue with sanctions in South Africa in the 1980s, right? I mean, at some point they were supporting the apartheid regime, and afterwards it became very unpopular, and so sanctions really were the thing that, you know, this is important to us, we have to put some sanctions on, and now this actually relates to the regime. So it doesn't set like PR. So
yes. And I would say PR might be, at least with its connotation, a little dismissive of this thing you're talking about. I think bringing up the apartheid South Africa example is a very good analog. There's an aspect to sanctions that isn't about the financial pressure at all. It's about stigmatizing. It's about making concrete your distaste for this regime and saying they ought to be a pariah. We do this with North Korea. We say the way that they treat their population and their illicit nuclear program and ballistic missile program puts them outside of the circle of civilized nations. They don't deserve a seat at that table. How do we make that concrete? Well, maybe we don't invite them to conferences, but also sanctions. Is that a part of the sanctions on Russia? Absolutely. I don't think that's what's going on with the oligarch sanctions in particular, just to come back to the yachts. I think the main theories are, as you said, these are people who might have Putin's ear, far more so than an average Russian. And so let's change their incentive structure. Let's make it very costly for them to stay where they are right now and encourage them to flip on him, or to, if not to flip and to flee Russia, then at least to start acting as a curb or some kind of check on him. When I talk to experts on Russia, or frankly any autocracy, they find this theory to be really naive. Why? Because think about put yourself in the shoes of one of these oligarchs. So where's your family? Where are all your friends? They're in Russia. I mean, maybe you have children who are in school in London, in school in Europe, in the United States, maybe at SAIS. I hope you're not in the audience and I'm not antagonizing you right now. But you have tremendous vulnerability with respect to your own safety, your family safety in Russia. Not to mention, if financial hits are what you're worried about, you're most vulnerable in Russia. So you might have just lost a $400 million yacht, and that might be very upsetting. But all of your wealth comes out of your corporate holdings in Russia. Going to Putin and saying, I'm not on board with this war anymore. And you can pretty that up however nicely you want and say, I'm totally on board, but maybe we should think about an alternative, softer approach. Putin's not dumb. He hears that as you are disloyal. So you've now jeopardized everything, much more than your yacht. So the theory of them going in to try to urge restraint, at least when I talk to experts on leadership psychology and on the Russian system, they find it altogether implausible. Which then leaves open the question of if senior US, British, European policymakers are getting the advice, as I know they are, of those same experts, what is the theory of the case then of putting these oligarchs on a sanctions list and moving so aggressively to try to take away their yachts, if we don't have the hope that they're going to actually change Putin's decision making? Let's go to someone who hasn't raised their hand yet. Yeah, back row.
Yeah, I guess I'm curious if maybe it's a demonstration of like changes in tolerance. Like, so the U.S. is sort of like, for example, like U.S. has historically like tolerated a certain degree of like Russian like abuse of the international system, of international financial markets, of like their industrial base, and like yachts maybe don't necessarily have a huge bearing on the actual war in Ukraine, but it's like a progressive show of force in the sense of like, okay, like the more you continue this like this war, like we're going to continue showing you ways that we can like mess with your life until we finally get to like the nuclear core of what your power structure is, which is Putin and his family, and like the entire like Russian like financial system, like its industrial base, etc.
Good. So I was hoping somebody would bring that out. You said it much more articulately than I usually see it described, but I would simplify that, tell me if you disagree, as punishment. Even if we acknowledge that we're not going to change Putin's behavior or these oligarchs' behavior in terms of what they're saying to Vladimir Putin, we might still think we ought to go after their assets because they deserve it. This whole thing is deplorable, and anyone who's even close to Putin's inner circle should be punished, even if we're not going to change their behavior. That, to me, is entirely plausible. It does bring me back to the threshold question I asked at the beginning. Okay, well then you'd want to be sure you're hitting the ones who really do deserve it, as opposed to the ones who actually eat alone with Putin and can't stand it. But I think that's out there. That is not how policymakers typically are talking about this. Although there was another thread in what you've said that's also interesting, which I kind of characterize as defensive. We need to protect our financial systems and their legitimacy against ill-gotten gains. It's what you hear typically with like narcotics proceeds and money laundering. There's something dirty about the money of Timchenko and the Rotenbergs and Deripaska. And so it shouldn't be sloshing around in US banks, Merrill Lynch, BNP Paribas, Barclays. We need to protect ourselves from dirty money, and that includes these oligarchs' funds. That, too, is a theory. I say defensive because it's sort of like we don't have to sanction the yacht wherever it goes, but we're not going to let it come here. When you look at how this sanctions campaign is being prosecuted, it is we're going to follow it wherever it goes. I was just looking at an article this morning. U.S. officials prevailed on the government of Fiji, which previously had tried to abstain from taking any position on the Ukraine crisis, and they then seized a several $100 million yacht of one of the oligarchs who thought it was a safe place to park their yacht. Okay, so now it was seized. But that betrays perspective that it's not just about protecting our ports, our banks, our investment markets. It's about getting at the oligarchs, which I think brings to mind the second point you made about punishment. Any other theories we haven't yet mentioned as to why you would want to financially go after these oligarchs? Yeah?
Well, I understand on the individual oligarch level why it would make sense that taking one person's $40 million yacht would encourage them to go confront Putin. But is it less likely to think that on the whole, a group of oligarchs, or like 100 oligarchs, would be able to turn a political dynamic?
Great. So could you get to kind of a tipping point where Putin is just increasingly isolated? So here too, let me say, I am not a Russia expert, not on Russian leadership, Russian politics, or the Russian system. But I talk to as many people like that as I can, because part of my job is trying to be smart about these dynamics. What they say is that those people are not at the center of power in Russia. the elites who actually Putin needs are not the people I just mentioned, but the heads of the security services, the heads of the military, the head of intelligence, and those senior people. That's the world he comes from. They control the actual instruments of state power, and between the military, intelligence, security, that's where he needs. And if those people flipped on him and said, boss, this is unsustainable, we need to go to the negotiating table, save face, that would actually make a difference. Have we sanctioned those people? Yes. Is it doing anything? I would say almost nothing. Because those people don't have yachts and don't have Chelsea football teams and don't have all these other assets that are subject to our blocking. Could the oligarchs turning on Putin help to complement that? Yes, I think so. I don't want to dismiss what you're saying out of hand, but I think it would be secondary or tertiary in terms of pressure on Putin. If you look at the relationship, almost all the leverage is Putin's when you're talking about an oligarch and Putin, as opposed to the heads of the military. Another theory, because there's one other that I wanted to get on the table. Oh, in the background, yeah.
I think it's good PR. The average Joe on the street has no idea what SWIFT is, so cutting Russia off from that isn't going to resonate with the general public, but they can certainly sink their teeth in something showy like a rabbit in a $400 million yacht.
Okay. I would never be so cynical as to suggest that governments take policy actions because it makes for good news. But if one were of that camp, then yeah, you get great headlines from this, and it's pretty exciting, especially if you have a yacht in the background as you're doing your news conference, to be able to say, today we've seized this. It just feels like a Robin Hood moment. Like we're taking from these ridiculously corrupt, uber-wealthy Russians who are close to Putin, and even better is if you can say, and we're going to repurpose this, sell it, and give the money to the people of Ukraine. Then you're like really in white hat mode. I'm going to leave that conversation off of today's agenda. Wait, what are the legality and policy implications of actually cashing in the yachts as opposed to just freezing them? But yes, you had wanted to come out with another theory.
I was curious if you thought it was too fantastical of an idea for the United States to be sanctioning these people with the hope that they could somehow give some information or access to the United States in return for leniency.
Yeah, so maybe I was alluding to this briefly in passing, trying to flip one or two, where they would come in and they would say, I just need relief from the sanctions, I'm willing to cooperate. We have seen that, including when I was in government, on select occasions. It's very rare, partly because of the incentives that I was talking about before. You have so much to lose if you are basically treasonous to your own government. When you start to see it more is when it feels like the wheels are coming off. So Gaddafi's Libya, senior military people, of course, don't have any love for Gaddafi, thinking about exit routes. I think probably too soon in this Russia context. Frankly, I don't know how much these oligarchs know that would be of use to the CIA from an intelligence perspective. The most valuable things they might be able to tell us are where their own hidden assets are, so that we can freeze them, and I'm not waiting for that. Yeah?
I'm curious, so we're talking a lot about seizing assets that they have, but the other side of the sanction is cutting off their ability to do business internationally, which actually does hurt the Russian system, right? Like if we choke off the Russian economy, that's money that he can't pour into his military.
Good. So I'll take two insights out of that. One is not related exactly to the narrower oligarch question, but yes, one big theory of the Russia sanctions in general is to cripple their economy and to make it harder for them to prosecute the war effort. But there are some who also carry that logic over to the oligarch context and say these individuals have billions of dollars. Putin has turned to them in the past for economic support, sometimes financial, sometimes in kind. So when the Sochi Olympics were coming and Putin needed all this infrastructure thrown up, he turned to his oligarchs and he said, go build me an Olympic village, go build me a stadium. Could they conceivably be playing similar roles in the Ukraine effort? Maybe. I mean, they're not, most of them aren't in the defense sector, but Putin's going to be short on cash. And so that last theory, I think, was the only one we were missing. You guys have been terrific, by the way. The only one we were missing in terms of the various theories in the case would be, even if you don't think they're going to try to influence Putin, you're starving the war effort, maybe indirectly, by locking up these yachts and these assets. As I said, it's a little bit attenuated when it comes to the Russian military budget, but I don't think we should rule it out altogether. Okay, so yes?
Just curious, a lot of this discussion has been kind of against Russia, but is there an element kind of in parallel? Like assuming that the alliance, the Western alliance would all kind of join together, have an agreement on a sanctions regime, is there also an element of encouraging or strengthening that alliance by starting to seize yachts and encouraging France and the UK, other countries that kind of fall in shape, especially like the EU?
Give me one more sentence on the logic behind that. I just want to make sure I'm understanding.
So naturally, the US is the NATO leader, right? So it would lead in kind of military capabilities. But is sanctions kind of if you look at it as another aspect of how we're punishing Russia, or how the reaction, the Western reaction towards Russia, was it assumed that all of the Western countries would join together in sanctions, kind of because maybe under a previous administration that might have not been, or another administration that might not be kind of the de facto rule.
I see. So sanctions as a means of kind of enlarging the circle of allied countries who are involved in this effort. It's an interesting theory. I want to think about it more. My first instinct is, in this context, sanctions probably aren't so attractive to the countries who are on the fence. It's a way to immediately alienate Russia and show whose side you're on, and typically the broader sanctions have cost to you. So you might be forfeiting your access to Russian grain, Russian fertilizer, Russian arms. Think about India, for example, and how careful a line they've been walking with respect to this crisis. Well, why is that? Is it they're supportive of Putin's goals in Ukraine? I don't think so. Is it that they aren't sensitive to the notion of a larger nation invading a slightly weaker nation who borders them and the importance of standing up against that? No, I think India is actually very worried about that principle. But there are other things they are worried about. And I think the sanctions are probably the last place you'd see India go, at least in terms of public express sanctions. They might be taking quiet steps internally to discourage certain business, discourage companies from doing things. I sometimes refer to those as informal sanctions. But I think the public sanctions are going to be costly for countries on the fence. Okay, so we've set out a whole series of potential theories as to what might be driving these oligarch sanctions. And I want to first note that there isn't a right answer here. And if you sat down and had a completely honest conversation with various policymakers in the sanctioning countries, whether they're in Brussels, in London, in Paris, in Washington, you might get different answers. I don't even know that President Biden has the same theory here that Jake Sullivan has as to why exactly we're pursuing these sanctions, but you could be 70% on theory A, 20% on theory B, 10% on theory C, and your colleague has those flipped. You still both agree that we should be going after every yacht we can get. And I don't know any reason to oppose these sanctions. No one is upset to see these super wealthy oligarchs being frozen out of their funds. So one of the reasons these sanctions get unanimous approval, every hand in the room goes up, is what are the downsides? This is not the case of going after the whole economy of Russia, where I think if I started asking, we could identify several downsides. We might all still think it's the right course, but there's collateral consequences for the sanctioning countries, for us, in terms of the global economy, in terms of energy prices. There's costs to the developing world, which is seeing massive consequences from these sanctions. And there's costs on innocent Russians who are not in our sights. They're not our targets. The oligarch sanctions have almost no downside. And so they're fairly easy to pursue. And typically one of the first instruments of economic statecraft the US reaches for when there's a crisis. But I want to now pull back, and I'll close with these thoughts, and then I want to invite any questions you have for me, because I unfairly was putting questions to you. This conversation, to my mind, needs to be happening more. about all of the sanctions we're pursuing. What is our ultimate objective, and what's our theory of the case for how this sanction or that sanction is going to get us there? And let me give you a very specific example of how that analysis could change very dramatically. If you were of the mind that Putin's behavior here could be changed, that there's some combination of costs and incentives where his calculus actually could shift to thinking, I need to go back to the pre-February lines. And that psychologically that option is open to him. Well, then that opens up certain theories of the case as to what you might do with your sanctions. If you were convinced Vladimir Putin will never do that, his own psychology, but also his own hold on power, would be completely threatened if he were to backtrack. He has risked everything on it now. There is 0% chance of him changing his mind. Okay, then we need to now go back to our calculus and start thinking about which sanctions make sense and what is our theory. A number of things we brought out today would still apply. So do we still want to starve his war machine? Absolutely. It becomes even more imperative if you think he's never going to back down to starve the Russian war budget. Does the punishment theory apply? Even more so. Does we need to get insiders going in to talk to him to see if they can influence him? Does that apply? No. There's no hope to that course. Okay, and then you get to, well, what about regime change? If we think Putin himself will never reverse course, and our ultimate objective is, as you were saying, to see all of these troops withdraw from Ukraine, then the only answer is a different figure leading Russia. Okay, now your minds should be spinning about what could economic statecraft be used to achieve that goal? If so, how? And how would we change what we're doing in order to pursue that, if at all? That's, I think, the kind of more sophisticated outlook on sanctions as a means to an end, sanctions as a form of assisting your strategy, as opposed to the feel-good, we'll get some good headlines, let's see some yachts. Okay, I'll stop there.